All right, today we're putting on our detective hats. We're about to go on a journey, a deep dive into 200 years of financial history to solve a fundamental puzzle about money. It's a mystery that has captivated economists for decades, and honestly, it has huge implications for how we all think about building wealth. So, let's get started.
So our whole investigation really boils down to this one big question. Imagine you had a single dollar back in the year 1800. What would have been the absolute best way to grow it? Not just the number of dollars, but its real purchasing power, all the way up to today. The answer, it turns out, reveals one of the most powerful truths in all of finance.
Okay, so in our investigation, we've basically got two main contenders. On one side, you've got stocks, which is all about owning a piece of the action, a slice of a company. And on the other side, you have bonds. That's more like the safer bet, where you're just loaning out your money for a fixed, promised return. So which one was the true wealth builder over 2 centuries? That's the big question we're trying to answer.
Now, you'd think this would be pretty easy to figure out, right? Just go look up the old numbers. But as it turns out, our investigation hits a snag almost immediately. The historical records, which are our primary evidence, are far from complete.
And here's the first huge problem, our first missing piece of evidence. The official U.S. government data on inflation, what we call the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. Well, according to the Minneapolis Fed, that data only starts in 1913. I mean, that's more than 100 years of our timeline just gone. We're flying blind, because without knowing how prices changed, we have no idea what money was actually worth.
So that raises a really critical question for our investigation, right? If the official records are missing, how on earth do we figure out what a dollar could actually buy back in, say, 1830? To figure it out, we have to become, well, financial archaeologists. Which brings us right to the next part of our story. Assembling that timeline. This is where the real detective work begins, where economists have to, metaphorically, put on their boots and start digging through the archives to piece together the economic past, fragment by fragment.
You know, researchers like Jeremy Siegel, whose work is the backbone of this whole story, they couldn't just Google this stuff or download a spreadsheet. No way. They had to hunt through all sorts of fragmented sources, old newspapers, forgotten government indexes, you name it. It was like putting together a giant jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing.
And this is how they did it. It's pretty amazing when you look at it. It's not one clean line of data. It's a patchwork quilt stitched together. Get this, for the early 1800s, they had to use an index of what Vermont farmers were paying for stuff. Can you believe it? Then they layered on other historical work from economists like Ethel Hoover and Albert Rees, basically daisy-chaining these data sets together until they could finally link up with the official CPI in 1913. So why go through all this trouble? Because it lets us calculate the single most important number in our entire investigation, the real rate of return. See, it's not just about how many dollars you end up with. It's about what those dollars can actually buy. This is the only true measure of success because it strips out the effects of inflation and tells you how much your actual purchasing power has grown. Okay, so we've done the hard work. We've pieced together the timeline. Now we can finally solve this thing. It is time to see what all this evidence, spanning nearly 2 centuries, actually tells us. And let me tell you, the answer isn't subtle. It's incredibly clear. All right, let's look at our first contender, stocks. According to Jeremy Siegel's amazing research, from 1800 all the way to 1990, U.S. stocks delivered an average annual return of 7.81% after you account for inflation. Think about that. For nearly 200 years, that's how much your actual buying power grew, on average, every single year. Okay, so what about the safe bet? What about bonds? Well, over that exact same period, U.S. long-term government bonds gave you a real return of just 3.70% per year. I mean, it's not nothing, but it's not even in the same ballpark as stocks. And this chart right here, it just lays it all out. The verdict is in. It wasn't even close. Over the very long run, owning a piece of American business just demolished the returns from loaning money to the government. That gap might look small on a yearly basis, but when you compound it over 2 centuries, it's literally the difference between having a nice little nest egg and building a real fortune. In fact, this gap is so huge, so consistent over time, that economists actually gave it a famous name, the equity premium puzzle. And it's a puzzle because, yeah, we all know stocks are riskier than bonds, but the extra return you get for taking that risk, it seems way, way too high to be explained by just risk alone. It kind of breaks the standard financial models, which is why it's such a fascinating mystery. So, you might be thinking, okay, that's a cool American story, but maybe it's a one-off.
Well, check this out. Siegel looked at the United Kingdom too, and the real return on their stocks? 7.75%. That is spooky. It's basically the exact same number as the US figure. Siegel himself put it perfectly in his paper. He said the behavior of these returns is remarkably similar in both countries. And that suggests this isn't some fluke of American history. It might just be a fundamental feature of modern economies.
So, okay, we've dug through all these old records, we've crunched the numbers. So what? Why does this 200-year-old story matter to you and me today? Well, because it gives us an incredibly powerful baseline for understanding how wealth has actually been created over the long term. All right, let's wrap up this investigation. What are the key takeaways from our case file? First, and this is the big one, stocks didn't just beat bonds. They absolutely crushed them over the long haul. Second, this wasn't a fluke. It was remarkably consistent in both the US and the UK. Third, you can't even begin to talk about real returns unless you first do the hard work of understanding inflation. And finally, the result is so dramatic, it created this famous economic puzzle that experts are still debating today.
And all this leaves us with one last really big question to chew on. Our little detective story has uncovered this incredibly clear pattern, one that held true through depressions, world wars, and massive technological change. The big question is, will the future rhyme with the past? Will the next 200 years follow the same script? History gives us a powerful roadmap, but it never gives us a guarantee. Something to think about.